Howdy, friends. You're listening to How the West Was Cast, a podcast dedicated to the best of the Western movie genre.
Looks to me like there's a squirt like you in every town in the West. Now get away from here.
It's kind of strong talk, ain't it, Mr. Ringo?
You're Hunt Bromley, ain't you?
Yeah. You heard of me already?
Yeah, I heard about you. I heard you're a cheap, no-good barroom loafer. If I didn't have something else in my mind, I'd take them guns away from you and slap you cross-eyed.
You're asking for trouble, Mr. Ringo.
But you already got it, partner. Because I got a gun on you under this table. And it's pointing smack at your belly. Now, you gonna get out of here or not?
That was a scene from Henry King's 1950 classic, The Gunfighter, which we'll be discussing today on How the West Was Cast. Hello, my name is Matthew Chernov, and I'm a screenwriter and an entertainment journalist in Los Angeles.
And I'm Andrew Patrick Nelson, a film historian and the chair of the Department of Film and Media Arts at the University of Utah.
Now keep in mind that our discussion of The Gunfighter will include some spoilers throughout the show, so if you haven't seen it yet, you might want to consider watching it before listening to this podcast. Okay then, Andrew, why don't you tell us about the film?
I'd be happy to. The Gunfighter was loosely based on the life of outlaw Johnny Ringo, known for his involvement in events surrounding the famous 1881 gunfight at the OK Corral. Yet the film owes much more to another, surprising, real-life figure, the boxer Jack Dempsey. As the story goes, screenwriter William Bowers was dining with Dempsey one night at the boxer's New York City restaurant. Dempsey, long retired, expressed his exasperation that young men kept trying to pick fights with him, wanting to measure their manhood against the former heavyweight champ. Bowers was struck by the tragedy of Dempsey's predicament and soon came up with the idea of transplanting the conflict to the Old West. Working first with Andre de Toth, who would go on to direct a string of gritty westerns in the late 1940s and 1950s, and then with fellow screenwriter William Sellers, Bowers developed Dempsey's situation into a screenplay about a once cocky gunfighter who has grown tired of his reputation, but is unable to escape it, no matter how he tries. Bowers had been deeply impressed by John Wayne's performance as the world-weary rancher Tom Dunson in Red River, and wrote the film with the Duke in mind. Wayne loved the script, but offered Bowers only $10,000 for it. Bowers balked and took his script to producer Nonali Johnson, who got Fox to buy it for $70,000. Johnson, whose writing and producing credits included Jesse James, The Grapes of Wrath, and Along Came Jones, expanded the script. Gregory Peck was cast in the lead, and Henry King was assigned to direct, the second of 6 times the two men would work together. The Gunfighter opened in June of 1950 to glowing reviews. Critics praised the suspenseful plot and restrained performances, along with the film's attention to historical detail, calling it grown up and extremely convincing, drawing an implicit contrast with other westerns that were not. Audiences didn't share the critics' enthusiasm for the film, though, and it earned less at the box office than Peck's previous western, 1948's Yellow Sky. This mediocre performance was blamed on the film's sad ending and on Peck's deglamorized on-screen appearance. Today, The Gunfighter is considered a Western classic, esteemed for its melancholy, unromanticized depiction of both a weary man captive to his own legend and of the nascent society from which he is estranged. Classic though the film may be, The Gunfighter is seldom considered in the same league as the most celebrated westerns of the 50s, including some it paved the way for. Gregory Peck's connection to the Western, or lack thereof, has unquestionably influenced the Gunfighter's standing. Like almost all leading male stars who rose to prominence in the 40s and 50s, Peck made a few westerns at the peak of his career, and made comparatively more of them as he aged. Yet Peck isn't as closely associated with the Western as many of his contemporaries. And unlike Wayne, Jimmy Stewart, Gary Cooper, Alan Ladd, and others, it's hard to point to a single persona that runs through Peck's body of Western work. This is due in part to the range of Western roles Peck played, as well as his concern about being typecast. After The Gunfighter, Peck turned down the lead in High Noon, and he didn't make another Western until 1958, reteaming with director Henry King for The Bravados, one of many attempts by leading men of the 50s to imitate John Wayne's unnerving performance in The Searchers. John H. Lenahan, in his outstanding book Showdown, Confronting Modern America in the Western Film, positions The Gunfighter as perhaps the most significant Western of the 50s because of how it directly influenced significant features of later films. Among these are the emphasis on the alienation of the hero and the frontier community's inability to cope with that alienation, themes that were especially relevant to audiences in the aftermath of the Second World War. Following The Gunfighter, it was common for the heroes of Western movies to be portrayed as social outcasts or psychologically troubled, or both. Among the most famous examples are Gary Cooper's Forsaken Lawman in High Noon, and director Anthony Mann's 5 collaborations with James Stewart, each about a lonely man driven to extremes of physical and mental suffering as he hunts those responsible for some personal or family tragedy. Rightly or wrongly, High Noon and Stewart Mann films like The Naked Spur and The Man from Laramie have long overshadowed The Gunfighter in appreciations of the Western.
So I have to confess, Andrew, when you first suggested that we do The Gunfighter for an episode, I hadn't seen the film yet. I'd heard about it, but between the generic title and the familiar-sounding storyline and the presence of Gregory Peck in the lead role, I just never got around to watching it. Peck's always been an actor who I've rarely been drawn to in the past. There's just something so overly upstanding and noble about him most of the time that his performances leave me a little cold. I do enjoy his villainous roles when he's played like Captain Ahab in John Huston's wonderful Moby Dick adaptation, or that bonkers performance he gives as Dr. Mengele in Boys from Brazil. But I'd say other than maybe The Omen, which is one of my favorite movies, I've always found him to be a little bit like eating your vegetables. He's that kind of good-for-you actor, and I just haven't really been huge on him. So imagine my surprise when The Gunfighter turned out to be such a great film. This is really a terrific movie and the perfect choice to cover on the podcast. I think you said before you've taught this film in the past?
I have. It isn't a canonical Western, and I guess I covered that a little bit in the intro. So it's not one you would normally teach when you're teaching Westerns of the 50s, but I kind of reached the point where after I had seen it a number of times, I realized it was just better than a lot of the other go-to films from the 1950s. And I found that students really respond to it. And then when you put it in, the context of the history of the genre, you get an appreciation for just how influential it was.
Is it a film that your peers often write about, or is it well covered?
No, it isn't. I really think it's a kind of blind spot. As I said, it's definitely a classic, but it's not a classic of the first order, which I think is something of an injustice. And it's a film I watch once or twice a year now. And every time I come away with something new. And again, I would say that its influence is really difficult to overstate. So it's certainly undervalued. And I think there's a lot to say and write about it.
Well, like I said, I'm thrilled that you picked this movie to cover on the show. So for this episode, we've each chosen 5 key elements of The Gunfighter that we want to highlight and discuss. Now, these can be anything from a specific performance to a favorite scene or a theme or a line of dialogue that we think is especially noteworthy. So, Andrew, what's your number 5?
My number 5 is Gregory Peck's mustache. Maybe the most famous story about The Gunfighter concerns Gregory Peck's period mustache. As the story goes, both Fox studio chief Darryl F. Zanuck and President Spiros Skouras hated the way Peck's soup strainer marred his matinee idol good looks, and they blamed the mustache for the film's middling performance at the box office. But the mustache is, of course, just one example of the film's larger commitment to period authenticity. And I think the mustache, along with Peck's soup bowl haircut, short-brimmed hat, swallowtail coat, help his performance considerably. And like you, I'm not a huge fan of Gregory Peck. I find that he tends to bring a kind of archetypal quality to his roles, which overpowers the historical specificity of whatever part he's supposed to be playing. But in The Gunfighter, there's a remarkable credibility to his performance as the crestfallen Ringo. I believe Peck is this character much more than I believe he's a small-town Southern lawyer.
Yeah, the mustache is interesting. I wasn't sure how I felt about it at first, but when it's part of the whole package, the hat, that narrow-brimmed hat, and that jacket he wears with those tiny lapels on either side, he looks so small compared to what we expect a gunfighter to look like. And yet he also seems so much more real because of it. Even the dust that he's been dusted with when he walks in, his clothing and his costumes have that naturalism to them that I think is really helps elevate this film. The costumes throughout it and the hair that we see, it's really a good-looking movie that way.
Absolutely. I mean, Henry King and some of the other people behind the movie spent time looking at historical photographs, and they did their best within the confines of the studio system in the 50s to make this look like what historical photographs showed us in the Old West. And I think there's a real difference between this film and a lot of other Westerns coming out around the late 40s, early 50s.
When it comes to the hats that these guys wear, compare Peck's hat to Mark the Marshal's hat, who has such a dignified hat. Has anyone written like a definitive study of Western characters' hats? I was just watching Once Upon a Time in the West the other day, and the number of variations of hats that we see throughout that film and throughout the genre in general, they each connote like a specific type of character, and we see them turn up again and again. Is there some place where has that been done before?
Not to my knowledge. There's probably a great piece to be written about hats and what they mean. I mean, in general, I would say an interesting thing about the Western is how the hats actually kind of get smaller over time. So you go from these really massive, like 10-gallon hats in B movies to something much smaller. But Peck's hat is noticeably small, not only in terms of the crown, but also the brim. So it really does stand out. It's not the type of thing we expect the hero of a Western movie to be wearing. And that's a piece of everything, the costume, the haircut. But no. So if someone out there listening wants to write the definitive history of Western hats in the movies, that's a great topic.
I'd read it, definitely.
Yeah.
So my number 5 is Richard Jekyll. Now, Jekyll, in my opinion, is one of cinema's all-time best tough guy character actors. We've seen him in tons of great films like The Dirty Dozen and Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, John Carpenter's Starman, and one of my favorite little cult movies, Black Moon Rising. I really loved him probably most of all in this pair of 70s horror films directed by William Girdler. One was called Grizzly, and the other one was Day of the Animals. In fact, I love those movies so much that years ago when I wrote a miniseries for the Hallmark Channel about killer sharks, I named F. Murray Abraham's character Professor William Girdler after Bill Girdler, the director of those two Jekyll films. Jekyll just has this everyman quality that made every character he played seem believable. In The Gunfighter, he plays Eddie, the cocky young cowboy who picks a fight with Jimmy Ringo at the start of the film and doesn't live to regret it. It's the kind of small but memorable role that he really specialized in. He did a lot of westerns and war films and was even nominated for an Academy Award as Best Supporting Actor for his role in the 1971 drama Sometimes a Great Notion, which was directed by Paul Newman. In a way, he reminds me of character actors like Charles Cyphers and Shane Rimmer, all three who were stocky guys with square jaws who just looked perfect in a military uniform or cowboy hat. These are just such great utility players. You could throw them in any movie and they brought something to the project. I mean, just listen to the way in that opening scene he keeps digging at Ringo, calling him Mr. Frazzlebottom over and over again. He's just begging to get killed. Sadly, Jekyll died in 1997, and movies just haven't been as cool since then.
Hey, Chuck, How about a little service down here? That's if Mr. Frazzlebottom or whatever his name is don't object.
Eddie, don't you know who this is?
You mean it ain't Mr. Frazzlebottom?
It's Jimmy Ringo, Eddie.
Well, it looks like Mr. Frazzlebottom to me.
Yeah, I love his delivery of the line, "What do you mean by that remark you just passed?" which he repeats, I think, 2 or 3 times, digging, as you said, into Ringo. You know, he does turn up in a lot of Westerns from the 50s through to the 70s. He's in 3:10 to Yuma, probably his most prominent Western role, as the second to Glenn Ford's villain character. But he's also in Flaming Star, skipping ahead a little bit. He's in Chisholm, Olzana's Raid, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. And what I find particularly remarkable is how he doesn't seem to age over that time. It's really quite remarkable. So that kind of gave him a certain versatility as an actor, in that he could play the same role. But it's almost fascinating to see him reappear almost frozen in time as all of the other Western actors around him age.
Yeah, it's great. He's got that Dick Clark feel to him, or Michael J. Fox, where they remain that same constant visual age throughout most of their career. What do you think it is about Westerns in general that attracts such great character actors? Like, it's a genre that's just loaded with them.
Well, I think if you look back in the history of the genre, there's a range of supporting characters that just recur. Most Westerns aren't about single heroes, but they're about groups of heroes. A hero is part of a gang, or there are ranch hands. And then there are kind of venerable types that appear time and time again, from old men, sort of the old cookie, cranky type character, to, you know, young hotshot characters. So I think that was just one of the conventions of the genre that lent itself, like the war film, to needing to fill certain types of roles. And, you know, from the 50s through to the 70s, there, you know, were a lot of war films, a lot of Westerns. And so these guys got a lot of work.
Now listen, partner. I come in here minding my own business. Now, how about letting me go out the same way?
I want to know first what you meant by that remark you just passed.
Tell you what, you just bought me a drink. Now I'll buy you one, and then we'll drop it. What do you say? Give him a drink for me.
Never mind the drink. I want to know what you meant by the remark you passed.
Listen, Eddie.
I ain't talking to you. I'm talking to Mr. Ringo. I want to know what you meant by that remark you passed.
My number 4 is Millard Mitchell's performance as Marshal Mark Strett, who is friend and foil to Jimmy Ringo. The Gunfighter's supporting cast, as we just alluded to, is filled with familiar faces who were, at the time, either new to the Western or to the screen altogether. So these include not only Richard Jekyll, but Carl Malden. These are 2 of their earliest film roles. There's also Skip Homier, who was then transitioning from child to adult parts. But the stand-up performer, in my mind, is Mitchell. He had begun acting in the 30s, but then carved out a niche in the 40s and 50s, playing authority figures, often in the Army or Navy, though he's probably best remembered today as studio boss R.F. Simpson in Singing in the Rain, which is a role that gently lampooned that authority figure persona. In The Gunfighter, Strett is a former partner of Ringo's who was able to leave his life of crime behind and start over as a lawman, but only because, as he tells Ringo at the end of one truly heart-wrenching conversation, "I wasn't as prominent as you are." So when you and I were talking before we started recording, you described Strett as the heart of the movie, and I think that is exactly right. He's the benevolent authority figure charged with managing the town's transition from wilderness to civilization. We immediately grasp how capable he is, but what we understand, and this is something that many characters in the movie don't get, is that his ability comes from his experience on the wrong side of the law. He immediately perceives the threat Ringo represents to the emerging order that he's in charge of, and he understands better than anyone the tragedy of Ringo's predicament.
He's such a complex character. He really is. It seems like it's his movie in a lot of ways, because I'm not very interested in the love story at all between Jimmy and I barely even remember what her name is. But Mark and Jimmy's relationship is just so interesting. Mark walks both sides of the lines. We see both a serious lawman and somebody who has a darker past and is trying to navigate both fields. And it's not a very easy walk that he takes. He's wonderful, especially at the end when he throws out, what's his name again?
Hunt Brahman.
Hunt, when he throws him out and kicks him in the face. That's such a great moment, that this kind of benevolent lawman who seems such a peaceful guy and is trying to
doesn't even carry a gun.
No. And yet when he kicks Hunt in the face at the end, it's such a great moment.
Yeah, and when we cut to that close-up of Hunt and we actually see the blood, which is a rare thing for just pictures in general around this time, it's really impactful. Yeah, no, your point about, the romance between Jimmy and his ex-girlfriend, Peggy, is a good one. Westerns, really from the 50s onward, aren't really notable for romance. I mean, we sometimes think of Westerns in terms of romance and damsels in distress and school marms and saloon girls and all of that. But what the Western is really about is male camaraderie. Sometimes a larger group of men, but usually two men who are often mirror opposites in some particular ways. So this film is a great example of that. And, you're right. It's interesting how, in a way, he is the hero of the movie. In some sense, he is kind of the moral center of the film, who has more insight into what's happening, more knowledge than any character, and has a kind of omniscience almost about how bad things are going to happen. There's almost a sense that he's come to realize some things that Ringo just never will, but he doesn't want to spoil things for him almost. He almost wants to let him believe a kind of new lie, even as he's trying to give up an old one.
My number 4 is the depiction of children in the Gunfighter. Now, kids have always factored into Westerns in interesting and important ways, from little Joey and Shane to Matty Ross in True Grit to the group of schoolboys who partner with John Wayne and the Cowboys. Kids have really been used as both characters and symbols throughout the entire history of the genre. In the Gunfighter, we meet Ringo's 8-year-old son, Jimmy, played by a 10-year-old actor named B.G. Norman. And he went on to have a respectable career as a television actor in the 50s and 60s. He's uncredited in The Gunfighter, which is a shame, I think, because he's very, very good in the role. Just take a look at the scene between Ringo and his son at the very end of the film. I love the way that young Jimmy both stands up to Ringo and yet physically keeps his distance as well. They do a sort of a dance in that little room, trying to both approach each other and to stay apart. B.G. really delivers as Ringo's son. He reminds me in a way of a young Ron Howard in The Andy Griffith Show, in that he's both natural and mature when speaking to adults, without seeming overly precocious. So what do you think of his performance?
I agree with you. I think that the exchange between Ringo and Jimmy at the end of the picture kind of gets to one of the issues at the heart of the movie, and that's the difference between kind of words and deeds. That physical distance kind of tells us more than Jimmy's own persona that he feels the need to adopt in that particular moment because of the way he thinks he's supposed to act. And ultimately, those differences begin to break down as the two get closer. And then what's interesting is that Ringo then proceeds to feed him basically a string of lies, reminding us that he is essentially a child. But I think that's an important thing that this film does. To me, one of the most striking images in the movie are of the children's faces pressed to the saloon windows, looking in at Ringo, hoping to see a gunfight. And I can't help but wonder if the film is kind of suggesting that that's been the audience for Westerns. You're kind of placed in this juvenile position where you're aware of myths. And so you're just looking, hoping, waiting to see some kind of violent confrontation that ultimately comes in the Gunfighter, but not in the way that anyone's expecting. I can't help but think that this is at least part of a kind of criticism that the film is making, not only about the nature of myth at the time, but also how that may be extended to present day. And then you have a character like Hunt, who's kind of halfway in between the two. Like Jekyll's character in the opening scene, he is young, and that plays into his belief in his own ability to stand up to this seasoned gunfighter.
Yeah, seeing those kids pressed up against that window, just waiting to see what happens. It adds suspense to the film because the idea of a gunfight suddenly breaking out among a bunch of kids can't help but increase the tension there as the climax approaches. It's not that far from the kids at the beginning of the Wild Bunch torturing their little
with the ants
and
the
scorpion. Ants and the scorpion.
Yeah.
They're sort of going for the same thing there in a way, that kind of haunting image of childhood juxtaposed with violence.
Yeah, I mean, there's maybe a suggestion that there's something sadistic, although it's not like that when you're a child because you're just using your imagination and you don't actually understand the real world consequences of some of the things that you're idolizing. But there's this idea that at least some characters in Westerns, usually the heroes, retain something of that. So, there's a shot of the children arguing in the street about whether, Ringo could beat Wyatt Earp in a gunfight, right? And it's kids bickering. But then, there are adult men who have that same conversation. And then when Mark tells Ringo that his son is a Wyatt Earp man, Ringo takes offense at this and says, you ought to taught him better than that. And then Mark's reply is perfect, that, it wasn't his responsibility. So there's a kind of sense that we haven't really left that thing behind, or at least the men haven't. It's only the boys who run down to the street to look into the saloon. But that maybe we actually haven't given up some kind of violent inner child.
Are you really Jimmy Ringo?
Sure I am. What do you mean?
Then how come you didn't draw when I kicked in that door?
Well, draw on an unarmed man? I never did that in my life. You got to give everybody a fair chance, don't you?
Did you ever meet Wyatt Earp?
Yeah. I've seen him once or twice.
Is he the toughest man you ever saw?
The bunch I run with, we just spanked Wyatt Earp's britches with his own pistol.
Really?
Why, the real tough ones laugh at Earp.
My number 3 is the inclusion in the film of many small moments that do nothing to advance the plot, but add greatly to the movie's ambiance. One review from the time praised this film for its pungent Western atmosphere, which is a great phrase. I think that's a really apt description of it. And I think that's the product of some of these moments. So these moments include Mac the bartender, when he runs after his absent-minded helper Archie in the street to retrieve a mop. There's this old man who apologetically interrupts a conversation between Ringo and Stret in the saloon to tell the marshal that someone is burning his house down. Completely inconsequential, doesn't mean anything for the story, but it's an amazing moment. There's a scene of Stret who breaks up this very slow-paced fight in an alley by throwing a bucket of water on the combatants. But that's only on the return trip. That's after he's passed them on the way and not done anything about it. So if the film's costumes and props and sets, as we discussed, create a sense of a believable Old West setting, to me, it's moments like these that show us life beyond the main storyline that give that setting a real lived-in quality. Are there any moments like that in the movie that stood out to you?
Well, definitely the ones you mentioned there. The fight in the street, I was almost hoping they were going to go for it and not have Mark douse them with water at the end or even acknowledge it. Right. I just wanted it to hang there as that little ellipses. Like, what is that all about? The fact that the old man who talks about his house being burned down actually references a character who we never see again or never have heard of, as though we're supposed to know it, who that is. Those moments are so great.
at least to me, it's hard not to see the inclusion of some of these moments is not the influence of certain types of European film that became prominent internationally after the Second World War. So, Italian neorealist films like Bicycle Thieves really come to mind. So the Italian neorealists were really interesting in trying to reveal contemporary social conditions, which mattered in post-war Italy. But they often did so by making sure there were these slice of life moments that could easily have been excised from the film and not have affected the thrust of the plot. But nevertheless helped to show us the actual lived lives of characters. So to me, this would be an example of American filmmakers who are always aware of what's happening internationally in cinema, successfully incorporating that neorealist impulse into the Western.
I beg your pardon, both of you gentlemen, for interrupting you. But this is a kind of a serious situation for me, Marshal.
What is it?
And the truth of the matter, sir, is that Wes Fuller's burning my house down.
What's he doing that for?
Well, he just felt like it. Marshal, that's the only excuse in the world he's got. Just felt like it.
Drunk?
He certainly don't act like he was altogether cold sober.
Okay, Matt, so what is your third thing?
My third choice is William Bowers' dialogue. Now, Bowers wrote a slew of great westerns like Black Bart and The Sheepman, and one you mentioned on a previous show, Support Your Local Sheriff. He also earned an Oscar nomination for his script for The Gunfighter, and it's easy to see why. Not only is the film tightly plotted and psychologically nuanced, it also just features some crackerjack dialogue that adds a dose of humor to the story right when it needs it. For instance, at the very beginning of the movie, when Eddie is thinking about challenging Ringo, he remarks to his friends, he doesn't look so tough. To which his friend replies,
If he ain't so tough, there's been an awful lot of sudden natural deaths in his vicinity.
Later, when Hunt Bromley leaves the barbershop to go challenge Ringo, one of his friends quips,
Well, he never was much fun to have around anyway.
And later on, when the kids are all peering in the window of the saloon, like you mentioned, and Jimmy gets called over to see his mother, you can see how disappointed he is, like he being pulled away from this. So he turns to his classmates and says,
Aw, shucks. Tell me which one gets killed, will you?
It's like he's watching a TV show and has to go and take a shower and get cleaned up for dinner before he finishes watching the show. It's all just a big game to him. But of course, it's not all humor either. For instance, when Mark reminds Ringo that the life of a gunfighter doesn't pay well, Ringo responds very thoughtfully,
Here I am, 35 years old. I ain't even got a good watch.
And it's such a beautifully simple way to express his regret that even this tough guy that everyone was terrified of doesn't have a dollar to his name. He can barely leave anything to Peggy and his son. So it's lines like that I think say a lot. At the very end of the film, when Mark forces Hunt to leave town, he just dismisses him with a casual,
Get killed somewhere else.
Yeah, it's really remarkable how almost every scene in the movie is punctuated with some fairly terse line that cuts right to the heart of the moment. I mean, I guess, this far in the podcast, we've already referenced like a dozen lines from the movie, which is the real testament. So I think that's pretty awesome. There is, I guess, some question about who wrote what with The Gunfighter, because there's, two credited screenwriters, as I said before, and then also Nanali Johnson, who was a screenwriter in his own right as well as a producer, is known to have improved the script in some capacity. And I actually don't know who contributed what. I had read somewhere that Johnson considered this his best screenplay or something to that effect, but it's hard to actually substantiate that with any kind of evidence. This is a very different type of film than other ones that we know Johnson wrote. So, something like The Grapes of Wrath or Tobacco Road or even something like Along Came Jones. This is a very different type of film. So like you, I'm inclined to think that most of what we see in there is Bowers, and particularly these great lines of dialogue. My number 2 is cinematographer Arthur Miller's crisp, deep focus, black and white photography. It's beautiful, and it helps to accent the movie's period details. But its thematic functions are just as important. The deep focus in concert with the consistent use throughout the movie of staging and depth. So that's where characters are placed in both the foreground and the background of shots. This contributes to our sense of Ringo's kind of dramatic isolation throughout the movie. In almost every scene, we see clearly everyone and everything that is peripheral to the gunfighter, how everything kind of orbits him as a constant reminder of the reputation that he can't escape. That kind of reinforcement of theme by real deliberate use of style is something I always love in a picture.
It's a beautiful looking movie. Both the depth of focus that you're talking about and just the high contrast. The blacks are so black and the whites are so white. It's just a gorgeous looking film.
I agree that, the contrast is really remarkable. And I suppose the easy thing to say would be that, the film is rendered in shades of stark black and white. And yet the film itself is almost the opposite of that. It suggests that there is no black and white. There are only these shades of gray. But that's maybe too obvious of a thing. I mean, the other thing I like about the movie are the shots that bookend the film, that it kind of begins with these, beautiful but also very conventional shots of Ringo riding through the desert set to triumphant music. He stops to water his horse. You see him silhouetted against the sky. So I'm guessing he would have used a variety of filters there to get that really good contrast. There's lots of things you can do in black and white cinematography that were harder to achieve in color in some ways in terms of filters. So we have that really interesting opening. And then the film ends with a similar kind of shot of Ringo riding away, even though he's already died. And what I find fascinating is how everything we've seen in between the two shots makes those latter images take on this very different connotation. We see the same image, but it means something completely different based on what we've seen the whole time. And it's shot the same way, so it's really, really powerful way to end the movie.
It's a very haunting final image. And you almost wonder if, was there a thought in there of seeing Hunt ride away, where they would show Ringo entering town and Hunt leaving, and they're both sort of cast in that twilight look that we see in both of those images. And yet I was surprised. I had to do a double take to see, no, that is Jimmy. That this isn't a narrative shot that we're looking at. This is just to capture a mood.
Yeah, riding off to that big range in the sky. Or I mean, what it's really doing is showing us that the Ringo of legend will kind of live on, but now we know the incredibly bitter truth to that legend, and that's the lesson that Hunt learns and will continue to learn for the rest of his life, however short that may be. So what is your second thing?
My number 2 is The Ticking Clock. Now, The Gunfighter is more of a suspense film than an action western. It's much more tension-based, and that tension comes from that mounting dread we feel as Eddie's 3 revenge-seeking brothers make their way towards town. It's a classic ticking clock scenario, made literal here by an actual clock that hovers just out of frame in the saloon where Ringo spends much of the movie. It's this ever-present reminder of the threat that's creeping closer with each passing minute. What's interesting is that The Gunfighter was made 2 years before High Noon, which is arguably the ultimate ticking clock western. Now, for a screenwriter like myself, I have to tell you, I've received lots of notes over the years from producers telling me to add a ticking clock to my film. They literally say it just like that. We need a ticking clock in this movie. It got to the point where my writing partner and I just automatically included one in every script we worked on, just to be safe. And the reason for that is very simple. It works. The viewer can't help but respond to the concept of time running out, partly because we all know what that feels like. What's great about the ticking clock in this film is that not only do we see it constantly in that saloon, we hear it subtly in the background of all of those saloon scenes. It's there like this ominous reminder of what's to come. I actually watched the film again and turned the volume up really loud and got my ear close, and it's in the background of every shot. It's this ghostly ticking that's just like a bomb is about to go off. Now, this may sound odd, but the ticking clock scenario in The Gunfighter reminded me right away of the similar ticking clock scenario in Brian De Palma's Carlito's Way. In The Gunfighter, Ringo is threatened by 3 killers who are trying to stop him from leaving town. Yet in the end, he's shot dead by a young punk that he mistakenly let live earlier in the film. It's the fatal mistake that comes back to kill him. In Carlito's Way, Carlito was threatened by 3 killers who are trying to stop him from leaving town, and there's this ticking clock through the whole thing of when is his train going to leave. Yet at the end of that film, he's shot dead by not those 3 guys, but a young punk played by John Leguizamo that he mistakenly let live earlier in the film. Both sequences build on that ticking clock tension until they switch things up at the very end. And since De Palma is such a cinephile, I'm curious to find out if he ever referenced that film, or he had seen it, or is it just happenstance?
That is an amazing point. It can't be happenstance. Now, you know a lot more about De Palma than I do. But, there are some filmmakers who are just so marinated in film history. Schrader would be another one, that anytime something like that happens, I suppose there's the possibility that it's just something that's in his subconscious from all of the films that he's seen. But that's actually incredibly deliberate. You can really map one onto the other. Oh, I love it. Oh, that's really good. So on a related note, it's interesting to note how many ticking clocks we get in subsequent Westerns in the 1950s. There's Last Train to Gun Hill, 3:10 to Yuma. But one thing I think is interesting, and I think this is often the case when, one film has clearly been influential, it's that the films that are influenced don't maybe understand the complexities of how a device was used. And I think you alluded to this, that, in The Gunfighter, the clock is there as a constant reminder that Ringo's time is running out. But what's interesting is in the film, it gives Ringo this false sense of security, in a sense, because his certainty at having plenty of time is contrasted with the audience's knowledge that his pursuers are actually closing in faster than he thinks. And then not only that, we get a surprise ending where it turns out the clock didn't really matter at all. So I think it's really interesting to compare all of those nuances to the very hard and fast deadlines that we see in most films with a ticking clock. There's something to be learned from, yes, it's effective, but it's not effective on its own that we have to hold you to this deadline. There can be more going on. My number 1 is the film's somewhat jaundiced depiction of society. For such a short film with such a large cast, The Gunfighter does an excellent job of developing its supporting characters beyond the stereotypes that we would expect in a Western movie. The town of Cayenne has an intricate, believable, and this is important, tenuous social network, which Ringo's arrival disrupts. Ringo's personal failings are, of course, many. Right? We recognize that he was a bad man. But what's interesting is how his personal failings are paralleled with the failings of the type of community that he aspires to join. As Stret tells the town's leading ladies who object to the outlaw's presence, and this is another great line, the trouble so far ain't been him demoralizing the town, it's the town demoralizing him. So in this way, The Gunfighter sets the stage for future Westerns like High Noon and Silver Load and Last Train from Gun Hill that take a much more cynical view of the civilization that Western heroes are supposed to protect.
You're right. I hadn't thought of it that way at all. Are there other examples more recently? Is that something that we see still in the genre today?
That's a great question. I think not. I think that one tendency after maybe the 1960s is to make the town kind of irrelevant in some ways. And this may tell us that Howard Hawks ultimately succeeded. I mean, there's a famous story about how Hawks, when he saw High Noon, objected to many things in the movie. But one of them was, the idea that, this sheriff would mope around and he would ask for help and nobody would help him. And what a good sheriff would do was just go out and kill the bad guys himself. So in Rio Bravo, the town doesn't really exist. We see people moving around, but it's not really a force, a social force in the way it might be. So I think over the course of the 50s, we see a lot of films where we have this, society is complicit in the actions of the villain, even if it's through their inaction. But eventually society goes away and we tend to focus more on the hero. And then the hero himself is often figured more outside of society. And there are some later ones. Kirk Douglas's Western Posse actually would be an example of a Western that tries to do some interesting things with the town, but that's an example of it actually holding up the town in the end. So I think the 50s is really the locus of these, society is just as in need of help as the hero type Westerns. So Matt, what is your number one thing about the Gunfighter?
My number one thing is editor Barbara McLean, who I think is responsible for much of what makes The Gunfighter such a terrific film. McLean really was a legend in Hollywood. She was born in New Jersey in 1903 and edited films for 25 years. She was also nominated for 7 Academy Awards for Best Editor, one of which she actually won. In fact, the same year that The Gunfighter was released, she was nominated for an Oscar for editing that year's Best Picture winner, All About Eve. She was a groundbreaking artist whose brilliant career included westerns and war films, sports movies. She even did a bunch of sword and sandal epics. She did it all. Studio executive Darryl Zanuck apparently revered her work and relied on her throughout his tenure at 20th Century Fox. It's said that he valued her advice above all others. And the thing I love most about her work in The Gunfighter is how tight it is. This film clocks in at a brisk 85 minutes, and the suspense never flags. When you consider how small the world of the story actually is and how few locations we visit, it's remarkable that The Gunfighter never feels claustrophobic. Instead, the movie breathes while the tension mounts, which is really unusual, and I attribute a lot of that to McLean's stellar work here. She quickens the pace when danger is present, but then later on, she lets shots linger and scenes play out. It's really a masterclass in editing and easily one of my favorite parts in this film.
Yeah, McLean is certainly a legend. If I'm not mistaken, I think maybe half of the films that she edited were Henry King directed. So that would make, is that right?
Right, they were.
Yes. So that would make their, collaboration one of, the great director-editor collaborations in the history of film. I mean, it's interesting that, the place of women in classical Hollywood is, obviously problematic, I guess, to use an academic term. But editing was one major role where a number of women were able to succeed. So, not only McLean, but Margaret Booth or Anne Boschens, who was DeMille's longtime editor. And I suppose, makes us think of people like Thelma Schoonmaker and her long collaboration with Martin Scorsese. With respect to this film, I think you hit the nail on the head that on the one hand, she is very good at keeping the forward momentum of pictures. There's never a moment when you feel like the narrative has ground to a halt, which is remarkable given that, as you said, there are moments where she lets the picture breathe, where she knows when to slow things down. What I really like is the judicious use of close-ups. So this is a movie where wider shots, as I've said, are very important so we can see the relationship between characters and props within space. But then there are these really poignant moments where she knows just when to cut in. And it's not always for a line of dialogue. Sometimes it's just for that right reaction shot. I think with the exception of maybe some unfortunate close-ups of Gregory Peck in his, final embrace with Peggy, which are a little schmaltzy, but, this is ultimately a Gregory Peck film from 1950. Other than that, it is such a tight, kind of propulsive film.
Okay, with that said, any final thoughts on The Gunfighter?
Well, I'm glad that you enjoyed it. Your reaction to the film is similar to what I've encountered in other people, that they really like it, but there is often some kind of hesitancy to actually take the picture on, even at 80 some odd minutes long. I'm often asked to list my favorite Westerns or what I consider to be the best Westerns, and The Gunfighter is always near the top of either list. as we've kind of covered, I think it's difficult to overstate its influence on the genre, not only in the 50s, but in later Westerns. Eastwood's Unforgiven, I think, is a film that covers a lot of similar territory. And I've seen David Webb Peoples, that film's screenwriter, asked about this in interviews, and he kind of just can't really explain it, that maybe he had seen The Gunfighter and it was kind of unconscious. But that would speak to its unacknowledged influence. And the other thing I would just reiterate, that as is often the case with influential films, I think it's actually superior to all the ones that followed. I love nearly everything about this movie, and I feel like we've just scratched the surface today. So I hope listeners will check it out.
Ladies and gentlemen, when the screen makes a bold and startling departure from the conventional, I feel that we in motion pictures should do everything in our power to bring it to your attention. I've just seen Gregory Peck in The Gunfighter, a picture and a character utterly unlike anything ever brought to the screen. He's a man of violence and tenderness, a man of tremendous strength and deep passion, and above all, a man who will leave an unforgettable mark on your memory.
He's a killer. He ought to be run out of town.
He's the gunfighter.
He hasn't a friend in the world.
He's the gunfighter.
He only wants to be left alone. Why don't they give him a break?
He's the gunfighter.
Well, that about wraps up this episode. Until next time, I'm Matthew Chernov.
And I'm Andrew Patrick Nelson, and you've been listening to How the West Was Cast.
Well, that was our show. We thank you kindly for listening and hope you'll come back again real soon. Till then, keep your saddle oiled and your guns greased. We'll be seeing you.